The afternoon sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, bright and warm, catching the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. I leaned against the doorframe, pretending to casually watch my friend's mom at work, but my attention was entirely on her. She was 40 years old, an American Caucasian woman with long black hair cascading over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin, and dark brown eyes that seemed to notice everything. Her curvy figure moved with effortless grace as she chopped vegetables. The floral dress she wore accentuating her natural elegance without being flashy. A slight smile tugged at her lips as she hummed softly, a sound that somehow made the sunlit kitchen feel even warmer. She turned toward me suddenly, eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink. "Taste this, just a little," she said, holding out a spoon of the sauce she had been preparing. Her fingers brushed mine briefly as she handed it over, and I felt a curious warmth, like a quiet pulse of energy moving from her hand to mine. It wasn't overwhelming, but it lingered in a way that made me aware of every subtle detail. The softness of her skin, the warmth of her touch, the steadiness in the way she held herself. The sauce was rich and fragrant, and I let the flavors fill my mouth, but even that couldn't distract me from the tension lingering in the space between us. She leaned slightly against the counter, arms crossed, watching me with a faint, knowing smile. Her dark brown eyes sparkled with amusement, and there was something unspoken in her gaze, a quiet curiosity, a gentle challenge. I tried to act casual, yet every glance she returned made my chest tighten, my pulse quicken in a way I couldn't entirely rationalize. The kitchen smelled of garlic and fresh basil, sunlight bouncing off the countertops, making the room feel vibrant and alive. Her presence was grounding yet thrilling, the combination of maturity and approachable warmth pulling me in. The slight laugh lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her long black hair caught the light, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, all of it drew me into a kind of silent conversation that required no words. I noticed the way our hands brushed again, this time slightly longer, and a shiver ran down my spine. It was delicate, fleeting, and entirely unspoken, yet it carried the weight of something neither of us dared to name. The age difference was apparent, but instead of creating distance, it added depth, her calmness and self-assurance contrasting with my nervous energy, making the moment feel both safe and electrifying. We lingered there in the bright, sunlit kitchen, suspended in that small, unremarkable moment that somehow felt monumental. I realized that this afternoon, seemingly ordinary, had already shifted something between us, a quiet connection that promised more if either of us dared to explore it further. And in that brief, shared warmth, I felt the first stirrings of a slow, inevitable tension that neither of us could ignore. The next afternoon, I found myself in the same kitchen again, though today it felt different, charged with a quiet tension that hadn't been there yesterday. She was at the counter, 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair pulled loosely over one shoulder, wearing a fitted blouse and casual jeans that accentuated her graceful posture. Her lightly tanned skin glowed in the bright sunlight streaming through the window, and her dark brown eyes flicked toward me with that same knowing glint, as if she could sense my nervous curiosity before I even spoke. She was stirring a pot of something that smelled heavenly, roasted vegetables with herbs and a hint of garlic, and I couldn't help but watch. The rhythm of her movements was mesmerizing, the gentle tilt of her wrist, the small smile that curved her lips when she noticed me lingering, the way the sunlight caught her hair just right, making it shine like a dark river. I leaned against the doorway, careful not to draw too much attention, but my gaze kept straying. There was a pull between us, subtle and unspoken, that made the kitchen feel both intimate and expansive at the same time. "Careful," she said softly, turning toward me with a playful smirk. "You might end up tasting more than the sauce." Her words made my stomach tighten in a strange, unexpected way. She handed me a small spoon, her fingers brushing mine again, lightly, almost accidentally, but the warmth lingered far longer than it should have. Every touch felt loaded with meaning, though we both pretended it was ordinary. I tasted the food, letting the flavors unfold on my tongue, but my attention was elsewhere. It was in a way her gaze held mine, steady yet teasing, in the subtle tilt of her head, in a way she moved closer to the counter as if the distance between us was negligible. Her presence was comforting but also intoxicating, a balance of confidence and quiet vulnerability that I couldn't quite name, but couldn't ignore. She laughed lightly at something I said, and the sound filled the kitchen with warmth. I noticed the small details I hadn't before. The curve of her neck as she turned to reach for a spice jar, the faint freckles on her cheeks, the soft rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the way her apron framed her curvy figure with an effortless elegance. Each gesture, each glance, felt intimate, though nothing was said aloud. I tried to focus on casual conversation, asking about the recipe, making small jokes, but inside I was acutely aware of every fleeting touch and every lingering look. The air between us was taut with unspoken understanding, an invisible thread that seemed to pull us together while demanding patience. By the time I left, the sunlight had shifted across the kitchen, illuminating her face in a warm glow. She waved goodbye with that subtle, playful smile, and I felt the weight of our connection even as I walked away. The afternoon had deepened something, an unspoken intimacy, a slow-burning curiosity, a tension that promised more than either of us dared to acknowledge. That day ended with my mind replaying every glance, every touch, every smile, wondering how long it would take before we could truly face the pull between us. That evening, I found myself lingering outside the kitchen doorway again, as if drawn by some invisible force. The sun was beginning to dip, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. She was there, 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck, wearing a soft, cream-colored sweater and fitted trousers that complemented her graceful figure. Her lightly tanned skin caught the fading sunlight, and her dark brown eyes met mine briefly, holding a look that was at once teasing and inviting. The small smile lines at the corners of her eyes deepened when she laughed softly at something I said, and I felt my chest tighten in a way I had grown familiar with over the past days. She moved around the kitchen with effortless ease, stirring a pot of soup, the aroma of roasted garlic and herbs filling the air. I leaned casually against the counter, though my posture was anything but relaxed. Every subtle movement of hers seemed magnified. The tilt of her head as she tasted the soup, the graceful arch of her back as she reached for a spoon, the soft rustle of her sweater as she turned toward me. There was an intimacy in these small, ordinary gestures, an unspoken language that I was learning to read. She handed me a spoonful of soup, her fingers brushing mine lightly, sending a warm thrill through me. "Careful," she said with a teasing smile, her dark brown eyes locking onto mine. That single touch, brief as it was, seemed to suspend the air between us. I could feel the quiet steadiness of her presence, the subtle warmth of her hand, and the unspoken understanding that lingered there. It was both thrilling and grounding, a paradox that left me acutely aware of every heartbeat, every breath. We spoke about trivial things at first, the weather, a new recipe she wanted to try, a story about my friend, but beneath the casual conversation, there was a rhythm, a quiet back and forth that felt intensely personal. The space between us seemed charged, each glance and slight movement carrying weight far beyond the words we exchanged. Her laughter, low and genuine, resonated in the sunlit kitchen, making it feel intimate, like a private world that existed just for the two of us. I noticed the subtle details I had missed before, the faint freckles across her cheeks, the curve of her jaw as she tilted her head, the way her long black hair caught the light and framed her face perfectly. Each small gesture seemed deliberate yet effortless, a dance I was only beginning to understand. The contrast between her calm, confident demeanor and my restless energy made every moment feel electric, though everything remained unspoken, safe, and entirely YouTube appropriate. By the time the soup was ready, I realized I hadn't just been tasting her cooking. I had been tasting something else entirely. The warmth of her attention, the subtle pull of her presence, the delicate tension that neither of us dared to name. As she smiled at me, gently brushing her fingers against mine one last time, I knew that this connection was growing stronger, deeper, and far more compelling than either of us could openly admit. That evening ended with a quiet, lingering sense of anticipation, the promise of something unspoken, something that could only unfold slowly, like a melody building toward its chorus. The next weekend, the kitchen felt alive in a way it hadn't before. Sunlight poured through the windows, brightening every surface, and the scent of fresh herbs and baking bread wrapped around me like a warm invitation. She stood at the counter, 40-year-old American Latino woman with long black hair cascading over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin glowing in the morning light. Her dark brown eyes caught mine the moment I entered, a spark of playful mischief dancing in them. The subtle smile lines at the corners of her eyes deepened as she stirred a bowl of dough, her curvy figure moving with a natural, effortless grace. I leaned against the doorway, pretending to observe the bread-making process, but my gaze kept drifting to her. There was something magnetic in the way she moved, confident, grounded, yet somehow teasing, like she knew exactly the effect she had on me. Every small gesture felt intimate. The way her hand brushed against the counter, the faint shift of her hips as she turned, the soft hum that escaped her lips when she was focused. Each detail seemed heightened, as if the world had quieted to let me notice her completely. She looked up suddenly and caught me staring. "Come on, taste a little," she said, holding out a small piece of dough. Our fingers brushed lightly, a fleeting contact that sent a warmth through my chest. I tried to act casual, but the pull between us was undeniable. There was a tension in that simple touch, a quiet acknowledgement of something neither of us could or would say aloud. As I tasted the dough, I felt the connection in every subtle way. The gentle warmth of her hand against mine, the quiet steadiness in her posture, the faint scent of vanilla and butter lingering in the air around her. Her dark brown eyes studied me carefully, as though reading the thoughts I hadn't spoken. She laughed softly, a sound that seemed to fill every corner of the bright kitchen, and I felt my chest tighten again, caught in the rhythm of her presence. We spoke lightly at first, about baking, about small details of the day, but each glance, each pause, carried weight. Her presence was comforting yet thrilling, a gentle tension that built slowly, quietly, in the spaces between our words. I noticed every subtle movement. The way her long black hair fell over her shoulder, the curve of her neck as she leaned in to adjust the oven temperature, the soft brush of her fingertips against the counter near mine. Each moment felt intimate, unspoken, and intensely personal. By the time the bread was ready to go into the oven, I realized that being near her had become something I anticipated, something I craved without fully understanding why. The age difference no longer felt like a boundary. It added depth, a quiet maturity to her charm, a grounded warmth that made every shared glance and touch feel profound. When she looked at me, smiled faintly, and handed me a small wooden... That morning ended with a lingering warmth, a gentle pull that left me replaying every glance, every touch, every subtle gesture, knowing that this slow, careful dance had only just begun. It was late afternoon when I arrived at my friend's house, the sunlight softening as it spilled through the windows. The kitchen smelled of fresh herbs and baked pastries, a comforting warmth that drew me inside. She was there, 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck, wearing a soft, sage-green blouse and fitted trousers. Her lightly tanned skin seemed to glow in the fading light, and her dark brown eyes met mine with a knowing, playful spark. The faint laugh lines at the corners of her eyes deepened when she noticed me lingering, and her presence made the room feel alive in a way I couldn't resist. She moved gracefully around the kitchen, preparing tea, the soft clink of porcelain punctuating the quiet space. Every gesture was deliberate yet effortless, The tilt of her head as she sniffed the steaming tea, the subtle arch of her back as she reached for a jar of honey, the gentle shift of her weight that made her presence feel magnetic. I leaned casually against the counter, though inside I was anything but relaxed. There was a pull between us, a subtle, unspoken tension that made my pulse quicken with every glance. "Careful, you'll spill that," she said softly, her dark brown eyes locking onto mine as she handed me a small cup of tea. Our fingers brushed lightly, and I felt a quiet warmth spread through me, the kind of warmth that lingered even after the contact ended. I tried to focus on the tea, its rich aroma filling my senses, but my attention was drawn to her. The graceful curve of her smile, the subtle tilt of her head, the way her long black hair caught the light. Every detail seemed amplified, each movement carrying an intimacy that neither of us dared to name aloud. We talked casually about the flavors of the tea, about recipes, about my weekend plans. But beneath the light conversation, there was a rhythm, a gentle back and forth that felt deeply personal. Each glance, each slight movement, carried weight, a quiet dance of connection that neither of us acknowledged directly. Her laughter, low and genuine, filled the bright kitchen, wrapping around me like a soft, warm blanket. I noticed every subtle detail, the faint freckles along her cheeks, the curve of her neck, the soft rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. At one point, she reached over to adjust the sugar bowl, her fingers brushing mine again in the process. The contact was fleeting, yet it sent a thrill through me, a reminder of the invisible tension that existed between us. It was safe, subtle, YouTube appropriate, yet entirely electric. I found myself hanging on these small, ordinary moments, recognizing them as extraordinary in their quiet intimacy. By the time I left, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting a soft, golden glow across the kitchen. She waved goodbye with that faint, teasing smile, and I felt the pull between us even as I walked away. That afternoon had deepened our connection in ways words could not capture. A slow, careful, building tension, a warmth that lingered, and a quiet promise that this subtle, unspoken dance was far from over. It was a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon, and the kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and simmering herbs. I arrived earlier than usual, drawn by the quiet anticipation of seeing her again. She was there, 40-year-old American Latino woman with long black hair cascading over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin glowing under the sunlight streaming through the windows. Her dark brown eyes met mine the moment I stepped in, a soft, knowing smile playing on her lips. Her curvy figure moved with effortless grace, the subtle laugh lines at the corners of her eyes deepening as she noticed me lingering near the doorway. She was arranging a tray of pastries, her movements smooth and deliberate, each action infused with a quiet confidence. I leaned against the counter, pretending to observe casually, but my eyes followed her every gesture. The tilt of her head as she inspected a croissant, the gentle curve of her back as she reached for a teapot, the soft sway of her long black hair catching the sunlight. Each small movement felt intimate, a private rhythm that seemed to include only the two of us, even in the openness of the bright kitchen. "Careful, you'll spill it if you're not paying attention," she said softly, handing me a small cup of freshly brewed tea. Her fingers brushed mine lightly, and I felt a warmth that lingered longer than the touch itself. It was the subtle electricity in the air, the quiet acknowledgement of a connection we hadn't yet named aloud. I focused on the tea, letting its rich aroma fill my senses, but my attention kept returning to her. The curve of her lips as she smiled faintly, the deep brown of her eyes, the calm confidence she carried that made every gesture feel magnetic. We talked lightly about baking, recipes, and small life stories, but beneath our words there was an unspoken rhythm, a subtle give and take that felt deeply personal. Every glance she returned carried weight. Every soft laugh resonated like a private melody meant only for me. I noticed the fine details that made her uniquely captivating. The faint freckles across her cheeks, the graceful line of her neck, the soft rise and fall of her chest as she leaned slightly over the counter. Even the way her long black hair shifted with her movements seemed deliberate, drawing me into a quiet awareness of her presence. At one point, she moved closer to adjust the tea tray, her fingers brushing mine again, and the brief contact sent a shiver through me. It was fleeting, yet it carried a promise, an unspoken intimacy that neither of us could ignore. The tension was delicate, a gentle undercurrent beneath our casual conversation, yet it hummed with a quiet energy that made the bright, ordinary kitchen feel charged and alive. By the time I left, the sunlight had softened into a warm glow. She waved, her eyes lingering on mine, a soft smile tugging at her lips, and I felt the pull between us stronger than ever. The connection we had been cultivating, subtle and unspoken, had deepened in ways that words could never capture. Each glance, each brush of fingers, each quiet laugh had built a tension that promised something more, a slow-burning intimacy that would only grow if we allowed it. That afternoon ended with a quiet warmth, a lingering sense that we were on the brink of something neither of us could fully name yet, but both of us felt. The weekend had drawn to a close, and the kitchen was bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon. I found myself lingering at the doorway again, drawn by the quiet familiarity of her presence. She was there, 40-year-old American Caucasian woman with long black hair falling gracefully over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin glowing in the warm sunlight. Her dark brown eyes caught mine immediately, sparkling with a gentle amusement and quiet warmth. The subtle smile lines at the corners of her eyes deepened as she moved around the kitchen with her usual graceful ease. Her floral blouse and fitted trousers framed her curvy, confident figure perfectly, blending elegance with approachable warmth. She was arranging a small tray of cookies she had baked, the smell of chocolate and vanilla mingling with the lingering aroma of herbs from lunch. I leaned casually against the counter, though my heart raced with the anticipation of seeing her again. Every subtle movement she made seemed heightened. The tilt of her head as she inspected a cookie, the gentle sway of her hair as she reached for a jar, the soft rustle of her clothes as she shifted closer to the counter. Each motion drew my attention in a way I couldn't resist, a quiet magnetism that made the room feel charged, yet intimate and safe. She caught me staring and gave a faint, teasing smile. "Want to try one?" she asked, holding out a cookie with her fingers brushing mine briefly. The touch was light, yet it sent a warmth that lingered far longer than it should have. Her dark brown eyes met mine, steady and inviting, carrying an unspoken acknowledgement of the connection we had been building slowly over these past days. The brief contact was enough to remind me how profoundly drawn I was to her presence, her warmth, her effortless grace. We shared the cookies and tea in quiet companionship, speaking softly about small, ordinary things, recipes, the weekend, casual stories, but every glance and every pause carried weight. Her laughter, low and genuine, filled the sunlit kitchen, and I found myself savoring the sound as much as the sweet treat. I noticed the delicate details that had become so familiar. The faint freckles across her cheeks, the gentle curve of her neck, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the soft lines framing her smile. Even the way her long black hair fell over her shoulder seemed intimate, an unspoken invitation to linger. At one point, our hands brushed again over the tray, longer this time, deliberate yet gentle, and the warmth that flowed between us was undeniable. It was subtle, YouTube-safe, but electric, a quiet affirmation of the emotional bond that had been growing between us. The tension of anticipation melted into something comforting and familiar, a delicate intimacy built from small gestures, fleeting touches, and unspoken understanding. As the afternoon drew to a close, she gave me a soft, lingering smile, and I realized that what had begun as casual visits and playful exchanges had blossomed into something deeper, a slow, patient connection that balanced respect, desire, and genuine affection. I left the kitchen that day with a quiet warmth in my chest, a sense of fulfillment, and the unspoken knowledge that this bond, built from subtle glances and delicate touches, had reached its first full bloom. There was no rush, no urgency, only a slow, beautiful intimacy that promised to grow stronger with every shared moment, every smile, every whispered laugh, and every brush of hands in the bright, sunlit world we had created together.